Hello, everyone, and welcome to our um, community table series sponsored by the Anthem um, Medicaid here in Kentucky. Today we have with us Elizabeth Vera from California, and she's going to talk to us about domestic violence, sexual assault, survivors and victims, and how to provide services and how to recognize all of this. And I'm going to go ahead and transfer the floor to her. Go ahead, Liz.
My video is not turning on. Danielle, can you hear me?
Yes, I apologize. I was trying to turn it on for you. Now let's see if can you turn on your video now?
There we go.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. Happy Wednesday. I am so excited to be here and see you all. So again, welcome to this webinar. I'm going to go ahead and start my screen in a few seconds, but just really quickly want to invite you to use the Q&A. To use the chat box to introduce you by your name, your agency, your role, and your contact information, just in the event that there are any community partners that want to connect with you. And then also just it helps me know who's in the room. And then I'll go ahead and start introductions. And then also we'll use the chat box for any questions, but also want to really encourage you to know that this is a conversation. Go ahead and unmute yourself and we can just go ahead and jump right into this. So I'm really happy to see you all. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. Give me a quick second. And let me know if you can see my screen, if someone can give me a, oops. So let's see. You see me, but not the screen. Okay, let's try now. How about now? If someone can unmute themselves, since I can't see and hear the screen at the same time. No? Sorry, we're having some technical issues here. Nope. All right, I don't have mute disabled. Oh, you can't mute either. You guys are disabled. Okay, good to know. All right, so let me see what's going on. Danielle, am I able to share my screen?
Sorry, Liz. I'm trying to work on making the chat thing option. You should be able to share your screen. Let me double check.
On my video for a second, see if we can figure this out. Thank you for bearing with us.
Okay, Liz, is it possible for you to share your screen now?
Let's try. It says I cannot start my video because my video's been stopped.
Oh no.
Okay, wait. Is your device system studio or later? Danielle, can I send the PowerPoint to you?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Sorry, guys. Let's go ahead and do that since this isn't going to work. Can you resources that align with their needs? So that's really the goal. Thank you. That's really the goal of this training. So next slide. So this is the triplex of trauma and violence that I wanted to bring up. So number one is that you'll hear the term domestic and intimate partner violence. These terms are used interchangeably, but we know that they don't mean the same thing. Here for you all in Kentucky, I wanted to kind of just uplift a couple of things is that Kentucky does have the 11th highest rate of femicide in the United States. Now, for those of you that are new to this term, femicide is the killing of a female based on her gender. And so what we're really seeing with this is that we know that domestic violence and intimate partner violence can be a gender-based violence crime, but it's important to know where you all are in Kentucky. The other important thing to know is sexual assault and violence in this country. About every 98 seconds, someone in the United States is being sexually assaulted. And what I like about this statistic is that it really doesn't just address the sexual assault and violence that young women or women are experiencing, but it is inclusive of male survivors who are experiencing this form of violence as well. And then lastly, I wanted to uplift another statistic for you all here in Kentucky is that you all ranked ninth for the new criminal human trafficking cases in 2019. Now you all in Kentucky are in a unique situation because you have so many interstates coming through you on the north, the south, and the east-west side that it's kind of like I would say it creates a lot of avenues for different forms of trafficking, not just human sex trafficking, but human labor trafficking and other kinds of smuggling and other kinds of violence to be happening. So you are all an incredible place. But I also want to say that Kentucky is doing some amazing work in the child trafficking space and then the violence prevention space. So I just want to definitely acknowledge that. Next slide, please. So a little bit really quickly about the risk factors, and this is something that really comes up in a lot of conversations, is that people really always want to know what can cause someone to become a victim of violence. There are so many different factors, but I did want to share this quick graph with you all. We know that witnessing and experiencing family violence and domestic violence is a risk factor for adult domestic and intimate partner violence, experiencing physical abuse, child sexual abuse, if there is a physical or a mental disability or an intellectual disability, this creates issues and challenges as well. We know if there is any issues of forced compliance. So we would think about forced compliance, think of very authoritative, controlling, domineering parenting. If we are looking at there is any kind of undiagnosed or diagnosed mental health conditions that a child's parents may have experienced, if the family has had any kind of justice system impact, whether it's child protective services or, the judicial system in this case, if there's a history of incarceration, even if it was brief, whether it was 3 days or long term, this can impact someone's risk factors for victimization. Chronic displacement, which we'll talk about more today, which is what we're really talking about, which is the issue of experiencing homelessness or chronic homelessness or falling into homelessness. And then there are some cultural and racial issues that can sometimes be taken into consideration as well. immigrant families can also experience high risk victimization because of acculturation issues. So here, it's just a really great social ecological model that I really like to show all of you is that the individual experience and how they experience their life really does set the tone for how they're going to experience life moving forward. And there have been countless studies that show that children who have witnessed or experienced domestic violence are more likely to experience violence as an adult and may lean into developing abusive or becoming abusive partners in the future. Also, our relationships with our peers. We're going to talk a little bit of familial violence, but familial violence is also one of the most underreported forms of domestic violence that exist. And it's also familial sexual abuse is also one of the most underreported forms of violence that is also not disclosed, not reported, that also impacts both in victims, but it also impacts individuals who will grow up and may become offenders themselves. We know that community impacts us all so much. So when a community is experiencing underemployment, unemployment, poverty, community violence, systemic racism, and other forms of oppression, this impacts our community and our individuals' victimization risk factors. And then societal, when we're really going to look at gender-based violence, we're going to look at transphobia and homophobia, and we're going to look at just how we treat people who are different from us. All of these factors really create this melting pot where people can experience all these different forms of violence and victimization. Next slide, please. Thank you, Danielle. Hi, Sarah. Hi, everybody. So compounding the risks. So this is a really good slide. Kind of it just talks a little bit more about what I just mentioned, but some of the issues that really compound the risk factors for becoming a victim of violence is homelessness. We know that the statistics say anywhere between 40 to as high as 80% of women and children who are becoming homeless or experiencing homeless is because they are fleeing violence in their home. Multi-causal trauma is also a really big compounding risk factor. So multi-causal trauma, think about someone who is experiencing grieving the loss of a family member. Maybe they're experiencing some financial challenges. They may just immigrated to this country. They may have experienced other forms of mental health issues or or any other trauma that can kind of exacerbate what they're already experiencing. We talked about the multi-systemic racism and the inequities in the systems that we discussed, right? So in trafficking, it's really important, and you'll see this in other trainings that you attend, is that in human sex trafficking, African young girls, African American, are overly represented and make more than over 50% of individuals who are being trafficked. And that's really important to talk about because we can't talk about eliminating and addressing human trafficking and child sexual exploitation if we're not going to really understand and address the fact that there are issues of inequity in this space, and even services and how they're rendered and how these young girls are treated when they're responded to is completely different. We know that substance use happens as a result of coping, but we also know that there's something called forced compliance when substance use is forced upon both the survivor or the victim of trafficking and exploitation. We know that child welfare system, we've all talked about openly, candidly, that the foster care system is often a pipeline both to jails, but it is also a pipeline to trafficking. And then also we need to understand that underemployment and unemployment, we know that economic justice plays a huge role in all of these issues. And that poverty as a whole is a really undertowing driving force for a lot of these forms of, particularly the trafficking and the exploitation. Next slide, please. So here's the intersection of DV and homeless. So I just wanted to bring up some general information for you because I'm not big on statistics. But the number of homeless children in the United States is averaging anywhere about 1.6 million currently. And we know that number could be so much higher because we know that a lot of our families don't identify as experiencing homelessness or don't identify that they're experiencing violence or either or that they're fleeing. In Kentucky, you have over 24,000 students currently that are experiencing homelessness across the state. We also know that that number is likely underreported. Now, the coalition did some great work, and I just wanted to uplift some of the work that you all did, is that you all saw a huge increase in homelessness 41%. So this is really telling you is that we all know that all of our states are in a crisis of homelessness, but this is a huge growth for a small state. Remember, you guys are only about 4.5 million as a whole. And then lastly, I did want to bring up and uplift the needs of our youth accessing services, particularly those that are LGBTQ. According to this report, 33% of youth who access homeless services identified as LGBTQ. Now, this is really important because LGBTQ are more likely to fall into homelessness, and they're also more likely to experience trafficking and exploitation as a result of falling into homelessness and ending up in survival sex or situations of just other risky behaviors because they're LGBTQ. And so this is really important to understand as we're moving forward in these conversations. Next slide, please. So how does violence lead to homelessness? So again, the study showed that as many as 57, but we've seen the rate go anywhere from 43 to as high as 80% is the main reason that it causes people to fall into homelessness and stay in homelessness. This is a great statistic by Safe Housing Partnerships. Again, you all will get these slides at the end. Next slide, please. So what is domestic violence? And I just wanted to kind of separate things a little bit because this will help you all in the work that you're doing. So DV can be anything that's physical, sexual, emotional, economic, psychological, any threats or actions that can influence or intimidate someone else, right? To manipulate, to humiliate, isolate, frighten, terrorize. And you'll see I'll go into coercive control in a minute. But domestic violence is usually specific to individuals who have a former partnership, former spouses, former fiancés. They may share a partner in common. They may share a child. This can be an adult child, an adult sibling, cousins, grandparents, aunts, and uncles. So DV can encompass, think of it more as like the family unit. Next slide, please. So in intimate partner violence, so just to give you a sense, most women who are impacted by intimate partner violence, this is the scope of how big this issue is before the age of 35. And we can see that many of our young adults are experiencing violence at a very early onset, which is why it's so important to have these conversations about raising awareness. So now intimate partner violence is also a pattern of assaultive and coercive behaviors that can also include physical, sexual, and psychological attacks, as well as economic coercion. There's also a higher incidence of animal abuse in this situation. And this can occur in heterosexual relationships, but also in same-sex relationships. And it does not require that there be a sexual intimate relationship involved for it to be considered intimate partner violence. And that's really important because very often the way that we distinguish when someone is experiencing violence or whether they qualify for services is that we want to know if that their relationship has had any type of sexual intimacy, and that is not a required to be a survivor or to be a victim of violence. So it's really important to note that. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about coercive control. I'm not sure how many of you have heard about this, but coercive control is actually not new. This is actually designed and built off the work that Johnson did in oh my goodness, a very long time. I think it was like 2008. And coercive control was really the early foundation of what leads into domestic violence. And so some of the things that we see very early on are the isolating behaviors, where the abusive partner may keep their victim survivor or their partner from engaging or connecting or communicating with friends and for family. We can see that there may be some blaming, right? We see this a lot in coercive control where the abuser will come off as the victim, like, oh, you made me upset, or this is what happens because of what you do. Degrading is actually really an important key component of this coercive control because it is really the degrading and the denigrating of the individual that breaks them down, right? And so what we'll see is the putting down, the shaming, the belittling, The interrogation can be an example of someone who's constantly questioning you. And even though you're providing an answer, the answer is never good enough because there is no answer for these questions. And I think that many of us, when we're working with clients, we'll hear clients tell us, oh, my partner's constantly accusing me of using money or doing this or doing that. That is just another way of systematically breaking down that individual. Now, the threatening can be both verbal and nonverbal. And I do want to highlight this because this is really important. And I saw this a lot when I did direct services, is that very often when we think of someone being threatening, we think of verbal threats or criminal threats, or we think of somebody expressing what they're going to do to hurt someone. But we have to remember that one of the things that I saw that I found particularly insidious is that not when an abuser is yelling or threatening at his partner, but when the abuser is staring at their partner. And it is the silence that speaks volumes. It is the whispering in the ear, the standing behind them. There are very many ways to be ominous and threatening and coercive of someone without actually being physically violent. And very often, what happens is that we may not see that as coercive behavior, we may not see that as threatening behavior, but it is. Now, gaslighting. Gaslighting is really an integral part of coercive control. There's a lot of definitions out there, but the best, easiest way that I would explain gaslighting is when the abuser tells the victim that the reality is not what they believe it to be. And so this is a really good example of someone saying, oh, you're crazy, or that's in your head, or you're imagining things, or it's really not like that. That's what gaslighting is. Gaslighting is also really used well by narcissistic offenders as well. And then we see stalking, and we'll talk a little bit about stalking further on. It's important to note that stalking is one of the most difficult crimes to prosecute. It's highly underreported, and unless the person is overtly making threats, sometimes law enforcement will not respond. Now, we've had some stalking cases that can go on for as long as 7 to 10 years. And it's important to note that stalking is one of the top risk factors for homicide. And so, if you have a survivor who's experiencing stalking, experiencing DV, and some of the other forms of violence that I'll be talking about, these are all really big, big risk factors to possible homicide. We're also going to talk about financial abuse, and how really financial abuse is really the main reason that victim survivors either choose to leave their partners but ultimately return, or choose never to leave. It's about that economic control that really keeps people in the cycle. And then the harassment, right? The harassment, think about it as someone who doesn't let you live your life the way you need to live it. Think about someone who's constantly texting you. What are you doing? What the kids are doing? Can I talk to them? Can I see the kids? It's basically impeding with your quality of life. So I definitely did want to uplift this coercive control wheel for all of you. Next slide, please. So this is just another slide that I'm not going to go into that you're all going to get, but this gives you a little bit more of a bigger, more colorful graphic, and gives you a sense of where the verbal and emotional and psychological, and how this wheel all kind of interacts, and all of these behaviors. Now, coercive control is very difficult to explain for a victim survivor, and sometimes for service providers, it can be very difficult to pick up. This is something that's it's growing. If you ever want to learn more about it, definitely look into the work of Evan Stark. He's amazing. So I just want to uplift that. Next slide. So let's go ahead and get started into the cycle and power of power and control. And I know many of you have seen all of this wheel in many different shapes. I choose a little bit more colorful one. But here, one of the things, again, we talked about is that coercive control lays the foundation for DV and IPV and other forms of abuse. That financial abuse is often cited, as I said, as a reason for victim survivors staying and often returning to their abusive partners. Housing instability is literally one of the top 3 things that victim survivors note as the service that they're seeking when they're calling the hotlines. And it's this fear of leaving that keeps them in those relationships. We know that immigration abuse is all extremely common, both in domestic violence, in sexual assault, in trafficking, and exploitation. and that a history of child sexual abuse is, again, a really high risk factor. And it's also important to note that fathers who abuse their partners are more likely to abuse their own biological children, both physically and sexually. And I know that this can be a very polarizing statement because one of the things that we've heard in the space is yes, they had their issues, but he's a great father. If someone is abusing their partner, that does not make them a good parent, period. And that needs to be understood because what happens in post-separational violence, when we'll talk about it, is that when the abusive partner is no longer having access to the victim, then they have to find other ways to control that partner. And that often leads to the abuse of the minor children in the home. And this is really important to keep in mind. Next slide. So, pregnancy violence, this is also really important, and I wanted to uplift this. About 66% of women who are murdered were experience, women who were pregnant when they were murdered were experiencing DV and IPV beforehand. Pregnancy violence is not spoken of. Many women do experience the first onset of physical violence, and it becomes more extreme, and the frequency and the intensity grows when someone does become pregnant. And that's whether the perpetrator knows or doesn't know, or the abuser knows. And so it's really important to know that 1 in 6 women are abused in their pregnancy, and usually it's within the first 6 months. Battering during pregnancy can lead to stillbirth, miscarriages, uterine trauma, birth defects. One of the things that a lot of people didn't know is that we actually have had infants that have been born with bruises, that have been born with broken bones, clavicles, dislocated shoulders, and other injuries as a result of experiencing trauma in the uterus. And so this is again very, very important. And then also we're not going to talk about it today, but there is the exposures of in utero to STIs and STDs as a result of pregnancy violence and sexual assault and trafficking. Next slide. So intimate partner sexual violence. So a couple of you may have seen this wheel if you've been to a couple of my trainings, but intimate partner sexual violence is really another level that is different from regular domestic violence and regular sexual assault. Intimate partner sexual violence usually happens where there is increased violence during sex, there is sexual assault, there is sexual harassment, there is the introduction of image-based sexual violence, whether it's consensual or not. There is exposing your partner to STIs. In California, we have something called stealthing, and I know that you have it in other states, but stealthing is when the individual removes their condom right before they climax. And this is done usually to expose the partner to an STI or an STD or HIV, or for the purposes of purposely impregnating them, which we'll get into reproductive coercion in a second. But intimate partner sexual violence is really important in this specific conversation because if someone's experiencing DV and then they're experiencing IPV-SV, which is what this is, they have a higher likelihood of experiencing further sexual assaults in the future, having multiple unplanned pregnancies, multiple miscarriages. They can have other health conditions as a result of this trauma, and they're more likely to experience future sexual assaults as well. So this is very important to understand that this is not your typical relationship that we think where there's some abuse and some sexual violence or coercion. This is a more extreme version. Next slide, please. So this is a sexual violence continuum. This is an amazing gram, but I wanted to bring it forth for all of you. And so in the center, you'll see the 6 original circles of some of the basic forms of oppression. Now, this isn't to speak to all forms of oppression. Again, this is an introductory conversation about some of the forms of oppression. And on the outside, what you'll see are the other bubbles notating the different types of sexual violence that someone can experience. And so as you're looking at this graph, this is not to say that The color reflects the intensity or the severity, or that one experience is more severe than the other. But just to give you a continuum of what that violence may be looking like and how it may evolve as you're working with survivors, as you're building rapport, and as you're just building your skill set and your comfortability around these conversations, that these are some of the experiences that our clients may bring forth that they may not readily identify or recognize as sexual violence. Next slide, please. And thank you, Danielle, again. So reproductive coercion, I brought that up a few seconds ago. We talked about stealthing. In California, it is not criminal, but you can file civil actions. There are other forms of reproductive coercion. There is the example of not allowing your partner to have access to birth control. We have clients who are not allowed to access prenatal care. We have clients who are not allowed to even so much as get annual checkups, forced pregnations. I had a client come in and she had 12 children, and this was an amazing client. She taught me so much. And one of our staff members had mentioned as she was walking by, like, "Oh my God, you have such a lovely family." And she said, "Yes, it's my little football team." And in that conversation, it doesn't sound like there's anything being really said that's important. And as we were talking during our interview, and she started to explain a little bit more, one of the things that I learned from that conversation is that all but 3 of her children were the results of rape by her partner. So when we're looking and when we're working with large families, I know that sometimes we are uncomfortable about it, or we're kind of not sure why they have such a large family. We need to understand that sometimes many of these children are the result of sexual assault and rape. And in this case, like I said, she had 12, and only 3 were her children of choice. The others were a result of being sexually assaulted and raped by her partner. And so it's really important that we have sensitivity about things and how we enter spaces and the things that we say, because we may not always know what someone's situation is. Next slide. So these are how these victimizations intersect. So the domestic violence, the intimate partner violence, and the intimate partner trafficking. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of that term, but intimate partner trafficking is really relating to this new space, and to really what we're realizing is that many domestic violence survivors are being brought in and experiencing exploitation, or are introduced into trafficking through their partners. It's also important to note that many abusive partners, again, use the impregnation or the children and the continued victimization to keep them in this cycle. And this is where that financial abuse comes in, right? That this will only happen one time. We really need this money. It's this false sense of access to money or having money. And that's part of where the financial abuse also is here as well. So it's really important to keep these things in mind, that all of these things integrate and all of these barriers kind of work against each other. So when we're working with clients, we may want to refer them to a domestic violence program, but that domestic violence program may not understand the sexual violence or the trafficking dynamics. So these can kind of counter interact, and then we'll go into how these impact homelessness. Next slide. So human trafficking. So according to the United Nations, and I just wanted to bring it in just a general description, but it's the recruitment, the transportation, the transferring, the harboring, and the receipt of persons or for improper means, right? Through force, abduction, fraud, or coercion. And I really want to encourage you all to really look at, just focus on the coercion piece, focus on the fraud piece, and focus on the force piece. Yes, abduction does occur in human trafficking, and it does occur in human smuggling, but really often, more than not, overwhelmingly over 70% of the cases really involve somebody that the victim survivor knew, was intimately related to, or was familial trafficking. And so it's really important to keep that in mind, because as I've done these trainings and I been seeing this a lot in the media. Everybody's talking a lot about abduction and how to stay safe from abduction and what to look out for. But it's really the people that you know, really the people that are in their intimate circle, in their familial circle, that we really want to be worried about, because those are the ones that are more likely to abuse. And it's important to note that anybody under the age of 18 is automatically considered a victim of human sex trafficking because they're a minor, and that would be considered commercial sexual exploitation. You'll hear the term CSE or CSEC, which is CSEC. Next slide. So intimate partner trafficking is really important to understand because this is where the partner compels their victim to engage in commercial sex. It could be stripping, it could be active prostitution, it could be forced labor, involuntary servitude, right? Cleaning for someone, being a caretaker, taking care of their parents, doing all of the things that they do without any compensation or pay. And so they may tell them that it's for the benefit of their family. And this is something very often that we hear when we're working with individuals who experience both domestic violence and trafficking and sexual assault as well, is that they really feel like this is the only way they have or the only means they can to financially support their partner. Now, it's also really important as we're doing the work. Again, I'm going to just uplift a personal case really importantly because it just brought a lot to the forefront. We had a young woman come into our into our offices when I worked at Hotfix. Excuse me. And she had been sitting in the lobby. She had a newborn baby. And this was a really ugly case. She had actually been beaten up outside of our doors. And so we brought her in and we saw that she had been assaulted. And through the conversation, and I asked her, do you have somewhere to go? Do you have somewhere to call? And one of the things that she related, she said, no, I just got here from Missouri. Well, not knowing a lot back then, as much as I know now, one of the things looking back that came from that conversation was that on the forefront, it looked like DV, right? Just a straight, they're both arguing, that it would look like a domestic issue. But one of the things that I learned through my conversation with her is that he had just flown her in the night before. And the reason that he was physically assaulting her was because he had tried to sexually assault her last night. And one of the things that came from is that he had flown her in with the intention to traffic her, but had lured her online through this promise of a relationship and that he would help her with her child and provide for her. So this gives you a scope of sometimes what's coming in the door may appear to be like domestic violence, simply, but when we get into these conversations, we'll hear that there is sexual violence going on, sexual assault, and then really that the underlying motive, for like in this case particularly, was the fact that it was going to be intimate partner trafficking. And so she fled and she went into homeless services, and then we lost track of her. But it is really important to keep those things in mind when we're doing this work. Next slide, please. So familial trafficking. So it is basically when family members, often adults or older individuals, compel their relatives to engage in commercial sex. Now, this is not uncommon across the board. And we haven't really talked about this. A lot of people aren't comfortable talking about familial trafficking, but very often we see young children and young adults who are groomed very early on and then brought into this space by caretakers. It could be aunts and uncles, it could be cousins. We've seen a lot of peer facilitated trafficking as well. Um, Yes, thank you. And we've seen a lot of peer facilitated trafficking. I've also seen a lot of, and one of the things we've seen a lot with our CSEC families is that these families are, particularly when they're living in motels and hotels, these are high exploitation sites. So these are risk factors for these children. And sometimes families don't see it as familial trafficking, and the child may not see it, but they may see it as something of convenience or a need. We've had youth who've been exploited by their families to pay the rent so that they don't get kicked out by the landlord. We've seen children exploit or engage in some of these trafficking dynamics because they're bringing in money to pay for food or to pay for utilities or to provide for younger siblings. And so familial trafficking is definitely something that we need to have a stronger conversation, particularly for those of us who are working with families or working with youth or transitional age youth, right? Or even those that are much younger. Next slide, please. So, where does family to familial trafficking happen? It happens in a family home very commonly and very often. More than not, it is in the residence. Does happen at churches and religious group meetings. Definitely hotels and motels. If you work with an agency that does trafficking, they will always encourage you to place your families at hotels versus motels due to the accessibility. Warehouse and vacant buildings. We've had a number of cases of our youth being trafficked and exploited by their parents' abusive partner, and being taken to warehouse parties or these vacant buildings where there are other parties. We had a young girl come in who was 13, and her mother's abusive boyfriend was not only abusing her but then trafficking her, and he had sold her on an average of to 18 to 20 times a day to older men, here in Los Angeles, in downtown Los Angeles, in the financial area. Also, it's important to note that in homeless encampments and RV dwellings, there is a high number of child exploitation and trafficking occurring. In Los Angeles, we use the term safe parking, but I know that other states do as well. There is trafficking going on in safe parking lots. It has not been talked about. And I think that this brings up those issues of we don't want to create discomfort in conversations, but the reality is that it is happening. And for rural areas, we do see this happening in barns and sheds. We know that truck stops are very common locations. And also, it's really important to know for all of you who are near military bases, there is a lot of exploitation and trafficking that is specifically designed and pops up around military bases. And that also the trafficking occurs within the military space as well. We have individuals who are traveling abroad and bringing individuals from other countries with promises of immigration, only to be trafficked and exploited and abused here in this country. Next slide, please. So this is the human trafficking power and control wheel. I'm not going to get a little bit too much into it for the sake of time, but again, the greatest risks of trafficking are when someone's experiencing any kind of fear of rejection and marginalization. Again, this is why our LGBTQ community is so important and so much in need of support, is that it is that social and familial and community rejection that really creates a space for them to be preyed upon. I didn't include it here, but it's important to know, and I don't know how many of you know, there are children under the age of 14 on the sex offender registry. In the state of Delaware, the youngest one they have is a 7-year old. So there are children and youth who are under the age of 14 who are on the sex offender registry in different states. The reason I'm going to share this right now, it's important to note, is that those children are also at a high risk for sexual exploitation and trafficking because the abusers can find them simply by going on the website because they're on the registered sex offender list. So all their information is there. So we're basically giving offenders where these prime children are and where they can be victimized. So I just wanted to uplift that. Again, exposure and experience to domestic violence increases the likelihood of experiencing trafficking. I had a really good dear friend of mine telling me not every domestic violence victim experiences trafficking, but every trafficking victim experiences domestic or intimate partner violence. And she was amazing and she taught me that. And that's something that I wanted to share with you all because it is important to note that those issues don't always intersect for each client. Every experience is unique. We talked about the parental incarceration. We talked already about the family history of mental illness. It's also important to note that individuals with emotional and intellectual disabilities are more likely to be victimized as well as those with communication disabilities. So we're talking about a community who may be hearing impaired or deaf. Next slide, please. So special considerations. So these are some things to think about when we're doing this work, that the trafficker or the facilitator or because those are some of the terms you can hear, could be the victim's partner. It could be making it difficult because then we have to try to figure out, and this is this is where my challenge to you will be. What what is the difference? How do we tell apart these two different, very different forms of abuse? How do we separate the DV and the IPB from the human trafficking? Remember that traffickers will often seek out victims who have histories of domestic violence and sexual abuse. One of the things that I tell, in the sex offender space, offenders can smell blood in the water like sharks can. They can spot these individuals out. They have a sense for them. They have a sense for their vulnerabilities. That's why we have some clients who we see are repeatedly coming in with multiple partners who they're experiencing violence or exploitation with. A history of trafficking may make them more vulnerable, right? It's really important to know in the space, there's something called the 7-day survivor and the 7-year survivor. Exiting trafficking is extremely difficult. It's extremely complex. It's a very difficult journey. And so, history of trafficking does create a higher risk factor. And then also remember that identifying a client as either DV or human trafficking may limit their services and their legal remedies. So, one of the things that we always encourage is that when you have a client who's disclosing or what appears to sound like trafficking, you want to get them a legal consult as soon as possible because there may be some legal remedies and some legal protections that they may be eligible for that are time limited that they may not know about. But again, that's really going to come about out of the conversation about. And then remember, if you identify DV and you send them to a DV shelter, they may not be successful in a DV shelter placement because of their trafficking dynamic. So it can be very limiting and very challenging to work with this population and to work with clients who are experiencing all these different forms of violence. Next slide, please. So DV and intimate partner, we know that it really is an overlap, right? That it's not just being not allowed to leave your home, but it is being convinced, right? And so you'll hear the term, I've heard some people talk about the cult model and brainwashing. Um, but there also is the threat of deportation, the intimidation, that coercive control. And there also very is important to note that there is the threat of the abuse of children or the removal of children. Domestic survivors of trafficking often have histories in involvement with the judicial system or justice impacted. And very often they will not seek or file police reports. And they are often very challenging to deal when it comes to issues of child custody and CPS because of the trafficking. It's looked at as prostitution as well. And so this does a disservice to the survivor as they're trying to navigate and they're trying to exit this space. Next slide. So post-separational violence, oh yeah, next one. Post-separational violence, these are some examples. So post-separational violence is basically the way that the domestic violence shifts and looks as the victim survivor is exiting the relationship or has exited the relationship. Very often we have this belief that when someone leaves their partner, the abuse ends. And it doesn't end, it just changes. It's important to note that when a victim survivor is exiting an abusive relationship, they are more likely to be the victim of a homicide or a murder suicide than when they stay in the relationship. So leaving is one of the most deadly decisions that someone can make, just as much as it is for staying. It's also important to note that this is where stalking starts taking place. Again, we've had cases that are for a few days, and we've had cases that have extended 7 to 10 years. The other things that we see in post-separational violence is the financial abuse, right? Not paying your child support, not paying all of it, not paying any of it. Dragging cases out through court on custody, arrangements for visitation. We see abusers use the legal system to maneuver and control and continue to control how often they see their partner and how they can contact their partner through FaceTime, through texting. This is where we see a lot of the technology enabled abuse, where they are monitoring them through apps, through computers, through their Instagram accounts. A lot of our clients are found that way. It's also one of the things that we see is DV by proxy is what I talked about earlier, is where the abuse now starts happening or projected onto family members or relatives or their children. And this is something very, very serious. Very often we don't, when we hear of cases where there's been families have been killed by an abusive partner, we keep saying, well, why would he hurt the children? Why hurt the children? Well, because the children are an extension of that victim survivor. So when the abuser no longer has access to the victim survivor and they genuinely don't care, because they don't, not all of them, but some, then they have no problem extending that abusive behavior to their children or to the relatives or people that that victim survivor cares about. And we've seen this case happen in over the media in the last couple of months. We've seen multiple cases where people have come in and not only killed the victim, but killed the victim's family as well and the children. Next slide. And I want to thank you all for still being here. So these are just the 8 common that I already went through, right? The isolating. I will talk about the shaming for a little bit and the defaming because that's really important. In cases of DV and trafficking and sexual assault, the shaming, the humiliating, and the defaming is actually one of the greatest control mechanisms that the abuser has. This is where we say and hear them using, I have these images of you that I'll release, or I'm going to post these pictures, or I'm going to tell everybody that you slept with my friend for money. All of these tactics are used throughout the exiting and through for very long terms of time that keep the victim survivor in silence. And you have to remember that people experience trauma and violence in isolation. So when we see these things and we hear these things, it's very important not to pass judgment because we don't know the dynamics that that individual was experiencing when these things happened, right? The sexual abuse, sexual assault does happen, and it's not uncommon to happen when they're exiting a relationship or they've already exited the relationship. And then the wait, counter parenting. Thank you. Let me slow down. The counter parenting is important to know as well because this is basically when the abusive partner is working against whatever the alignment is of the protective parent. Like, let's say you have a child who has dairy issues or health issues, and you know what your child's not supposed to eat, and the other parent gives it to them on purpose. Or it's basically anything that's contradicting the appropriate parenting of the child. That's another form of post-separational violence, and we hear that a lot, particularly in abusive relationships where the partner is a narcissist. We know that those parenting dynamics are really dangerous. Next slide, please. Stalking, just a few statistics that I won't dive into too many because you'll all get up these anyways. But 74% of those who have been stalked by a former or intimate partner report that there was violence and coercive control during the relationship. So again, we know that stalking, we need to take it very seriously. Just because there aren't any verbal or physical, there isn't any physical damage or there isn't any physical threats or nothing's been written, it doesn't mean that there isn't a history of and that it doesn't create a risk factor. The average length of a stalking partner is about 2.2, but we do know that it can be far longer. Like I said, I've had cases where it's been up to 10 years. 31% of women who were stalked by an intimate partner were also sexually assaulted. Again, it's important to know, and I'm not going to get too much into the sexual assault piece, but we know that sexual assault is also one of the most underreported crimes, particularly when the sexual assault has occurred by an intimate partner or someone that the victim knew. And lastly, 57% of stalking victims were stalked during the relationship. That's important to note because the stalking can occur and begin during the relationship, continue, and more likely will escalate as the victim survivor is trying to exit the relationship. Next slide, please. So these dynamics are all really, really complex, as you can see. It's important to note that victims that were recruited by their partners have it jumped, the percentage is 22%, and it likely is higher as we're learning more about intimate partner trafficking, as we're learning more about domestic violence. We're starting to see this more, so I think it's not so much that these numbers are growing exponentially, but that there's also more awareness in the community, and I think in media and overall. I think these numbers are going to continue to grow and then to escalate, and we always have to remember that the challenge with the space is that very often so many individuals come into our space, into our work, into the services that we provide, and they do not recognize not only that they're not the victims of DB, but that they're not the victims of trafficking. And even in homeless services, sometimes people don't realize that what they're experiencing is, or that they are homeless, right? They may see it as a challenge. So again, these are all very complex dynamics. I know it's a lot of information for you all. We're almost done. Next slide. So really quickly, returning to other abusers. I saw this image and I was a little hesitant, but I think it was really important to put. Um, Individuals can are so scared to leave, and they are so scared to stay. It really is the worst of the catch 22. If you stay, you continue to be abused, you continue to be assaulted, you continue to be denigrated and broken down. If you leave, you risk your life, you risk the livelihood of your children, your shelter, your community, your social support system, your peer network, your employment, your housing, your shelter. And so it is important to note that about 43% of people who leave do return back to their abusive partners. It is really important to also understand that, again, child sexual abuse is a huge risk factor to falling into these abusive relationships. And then important to understand there was a really great research study that was done out of Arizona, to all the domestic violence shelters. And one of the things they were asking all the women in shelter were, what were their top priorities, for coming into shelter? What were their top concerns? And you would think that their physical safety and their well-being would top rank in the top three. Um, Interestingly enough, the third most important was their ability to provide for their children, housing, food, clothing, and what have you. Sixth was the victim, the abuser's safety, and then their own safety came in seventh. So even at the worst time, victim survivors are always putting others before themselves. And so we need to have that compassion and that understanding when we're working, because it's so easy for us as service providers to say, well, you should just leave. You should just go to a shelter. You'll see the slide next about why that's a challenge. Next. So why people stay is important. Many stay because of the negative reactions from their family and their peers. We know that immigration issues are a huge barrier for many victim survivors. Many are unfamiliar with the communities or the cities or how to navigate the spaces and the resources. They may have limited mobility due to their psychological trauma, their enmeshment with their abuser, right? How attached they are to them. They may have nowhere to go. We know that DV shelters are often at capacity, and human trafficking shelters don't always welcome families or women with children. And so that's a challenge. And then also, it's that perspective of what happens in that image of leaving that abusive relationship. And then also because maybe previous calls for help went unanswered. Many people have often said when they asked for help, they didn't get the help they needed. So they just can't put themselves through that again. Law enforcement response is a big determining factor. Very often, where law enforcement can have a great response and you can have a not good response as well. There's no way to say. And then we know child protective services, right? A lot of people are afraid of having CPS get involved and having their children removed, or being involved or enmeshed in that system. Next slide. So this is exactly one of the reasons that survivors are really challenged with that decision of whether to leave or to stay. So this was 9/9/2021. This is by the National Network to End DV, their 16th annual DV County National Summary Count. And so basically it's a day in a count, kind of like your homeless count, but it's for DV spaces. And so this graph represents the most seat services that were unmet, meaning over 33% were seeking emergency shelter and could not secure it. 36% were seeking non-residential services and couldn't secure them. And more than 26% were seeking transition or other type of housing support services and couldn't secure them. So when you look at this pie and you look at the unmet needs and the request and the demand for services, you can understand on any given day why someone may have a difficult decision when we present them with a hotline, or we tell them, well, you should just leave, or you should just go, or you should get a restraining order, or you should do this. these are the challenges that our clients are navigating when they have to make these decisions, is that there is an overwhelming need and demand for services that as service providers, we are not always able to meet. In the trafficking space, I can tell you that the worst day to find a shelter bed for human trafficking is Thursday through Sunday. Those are the most impacted days of the worst to try to get into a human trafficking shelter. Tuesdays through Sundays are the busiest for law enforcement when it comes to responding to DB calls. So all of these things, when you think about the perfect storm. Next slide, please. So these are some of the life generated risks. So the life generated risks for someone who's experienced trafficking will be long-term economic distress and poverty, a lack of employment, underemployment, physical health ailments and conditions, right? We can talk about all the other kind of health issues that happen, stigma and discrimination. There is a lot of stigma around being experiencing exploitation and trafficking, and then what people perceive to be what a sex worker is and what a prostitute is, and all of these spaces intersect. When we talk about sex in general, it creates discomfort. So until us as a community, we can start getting more grounded in understanding these dynamics, that's where we're really going to create true change. Long-term home location and access to transportation, the mental and emotional health conditions, right? Remember, I talked about multi-causal trauma. And then lack of support. These spaces are very isolating. Like I said, this trauma and violence occurs in isolation. Now, some of the other risks that are generated by trafficking are your physical injury. It is very little talked about, but um, some of the longest cold cases are, and the most common victims of serial killers are victims of exploitation and trafficking and what we would call sex workers or survival sex workers. They have a higher rate of death, earlier death. They have a higher rate of STIs and STDs. There is extensive psychological harm and abuse, suicidality, abuse of their children. We talked about the risk of losing their children. We've had a number of human trafficking cases in Los Angeles where the perpetrator is fighting the victim for custody and has won because she had the history of exploitation and trafficking and the arrest for prostitution, and he didn't. We talked about the loss of family support system. And also, we don't talk about this enough because we don't understand it, or some of us may pass judgment. But there's also the loss of the relationship with the partner. Even though it is an abusive partner, it may be the facilitator of the trafficking, it is still their partner, and there may be some emotional ties and enmeshment and true affection that the victim survivor may have. So again, when we tell someone you should just leave him, we're asking them to leave everything that's meaningful to them. Lastly, loss of residency, their status. We've had clients that have been deported, legal repercussions, right? Being arrested. All of these things are long-term generated risks that create barriers for people seeking services. Next slide. So this is a challenge for you all, right? Is this DV? Is this sexual assault? Is this trafficking exploitation? What if the client is denying experiencing abuse or violence? What if their disclosure does not make sense? It's not believable. I hear this a lot. What if the client is defending their abuser or their perpetrator? What if the client does not want referrals to emergency DV shelters or hotlines or legal referrals or counseling, right? Like, what do you do? What is this, right? This is why I picked this image. It's like, is it a wall? Is it a tree? Is it a snake? Very, very often, I get a lot of calls where people are trying to figure out, what do I do with this? Where do I go? And we're going to go into the next slide for that. So these are the barriers that I talked about, right? No immediate results. None of the things that we can offer are going to really change anything immediately. Victims, survivors are afraid of not being believed, afraid of being judged. They're afraid of those systems. They're afraid, and they may not identify as a victim survivor themselves. And then remember, sharing their true feelings can be very dangerous and very threatening and can be very emotionally and psychologically intolerable, right? If it's activating for us, as many of you have been in this conversation for 2 hours, imagine how activating it may be and triggering for them. Next slide. So, how do we support survivors? These are really four basic things: communication, collaboration, comprehension, and compassion. Like my four C's. Really, it is about creating a space and holding a space where survivors can experience what it is that they're experiencing without judgment. It is not for us to tell them what they should do, who they should call, how they should do it, what we would do. Because again, unless you're in that person's shoes, you do not experience or know what they've walked through or what they've been through. Next slide, please. So, some of the tips here for you, I won't read them all, but number one, understand the prevalence and the impact of trauma. Start with the victim survivor concerns, not your concerns, their concerns. Listen effectively. Invite open ended conversations and questions. Remember? And remember that everybody experiences trauma differently. Be authentic and transparent, particularly if you're working with exploitation and trafficking. I can tell you, they can smell your falseness a mile away and your lack of genuine care or interest, and they'll sense your judgment. The biggest barrier to victim survivors is they can read that community service provider's face. They can sense it right away, whether they can be open and tell you or they cannot. Promote safety and confidentiality, meaning if you're going to share someone's case, get permission from the client. Can I discuss your case? Don't provide identifying information, or don't share their information at all if they haven't asked you to, unless there's child abuse requirements there. Be aware of your own personal biases and how you feel. Respect their rights. Believe their narrative. In the DV movement, we have this say where we just say believe, right? It's not our job to say whether it is true or it isn't true, or it's believable or it doesn't align or it doesn't make sense. Violence does not make sense. It's not going to make sense for them, and it's not going to make sense for us. Communicate with compassion and comprehension. Use open-ended language. I cannot emphasize this enough. Sometimes I hear providers say, "Oh, well, it sounds like that's DV and IPV, and let's get you with some BAWA and let's connect you to HT." And people are looking at you like, "What are you talking about?" Just communicate with people in a very simple, basic way. Avoid any kind of jargon, because when you use jargon, you're using labels, and it can come off as elitist and create the sense of where they feel inferior to you because of the way that you're speaking to them. You can speak to a survivor in their native language or their primary language, and access interpreter services when needed. There are so many agencies out there that work with the hearing impaired and deaf community, and then just other languages. So be creative and reach out for support, and then create a safe space, validate their experience or journey, right? And then provide resources that align with the needs that they are prioritizing. So even though we may want to give them certain referrals, we need to make sure that what they're giving them is based on what they're asking for, because that shows we're listening to them versus telling them what to do, which is what the abuser did. Next slide. And that's it. We are done. Congratulations, everybody. We did it. We went 20 minutes over.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you to everyone who sorry, y'all. I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing my screen. I apologize. Thank you to everyone who stayed with us and stayed over with us and had patience with us with our technical difficulties. We really appreciate you all. And thank you again to Anthem Medicaid for sponsoring us and allowing us to have such wonderful trainers like Elizabeth to come and train us on this very important subject and topic. And we hope to work with Liz again in the future in the upcoming year. And as always, thank you everyone who came today, and I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday. Please take time and rest, and we can't pour from an empty cup, and all the work that you all do is very important. So thank you all for coming every day and for showing up, and for all the work that you all do. So thank you all so much. And
And I just want to thank Danielle too. Thank you for inviting me. I love Danielle is amazing, and the work the coalition is doing in Kentucky is amazing as well. And I just want to thank all of you for staying on, for logging in. I know it's right before the holiday. I know that this was really intense material. So I want to thank you again for your commitment and just for being here. And I just want to thank everybody that is from LA that reached out and joined on. I see you all, and I just want to send my love and appreciation. Nice to meet you, Karen, and Maria and Callie and Angela and just everybody who joined on. I just want to appreciate you all for your support. So have a wonderful holiday, and we will see you all in 2023. And then Janelle will get this all out to you.
yeah,
Bye, Pam.
bye. Have a wonderful week, everyone. Thank you all
Bye,
so much.
Susan. Bye, Kelly.
Bye,
I'm also bye.
everyone.
Bye, Stephanie.